passage today is Leviticus chapter 13. And you might want to take some time to read the passage first, because it's quite complex and detailed. And once you've read it, you'll see that it deals with what is, in the translation, leprosy. Now, this word leprosy, first of all, we need to understand that it is not leprosy as we know it today, which is called Hansen's disease. It's something different. The Hebrew word is actually tza'arat, so T-Z-A-R-A'-A-T, tza'arat. And it's quite interesting. Jewish people know exactly what this is. They have far more information about it than we do. And it's interesting to go and read some of the Jewish literature on Leviticus 13 and this condition of tza'arat, leprosy in the translation. Now, let's go and look at a few verses, a few key thoughts about Leviticus 13 and this tza'arat, this leprosy, the specific condition. And we find that at first reading, it sounds very medical. It sounds as if the priests, on top of all the other duties, were now supposed to be doctors as well. And they had to examine people and make diagnoses and so forth, but we would be mistaken. So if you came away with that idea after reading Leviticus 13, it's not correct. In fact, Leviticus 13 is all about a specific condition that the priests were trained or actually instructed by God to diagnose or to identify. And this tza'arat was simply an outward manifestation of an inward problem. That's what it was. And if you go read some of the Jewish literature, you'll see straight away they've always known that this tza'arat is just an outward sign of an inward problem. So if you're thinking the priests were doctors, here are a few reasons from the text itself why that is an incorrect conclusion. Look, for example, at the fact that they only examine the actual spot or the sore. They examine the skin, they examine the person, but they don't give any remedy, none at all. So the remedy, in a sense, and that is right at the end of the chapter, verse 45, it says, the person with such leprosy must wear torn clothes and let their hair be uncovered and cover the lower part of their face and cry out, unclean and clean. So, wow, what an interesting remedy. It's not a remedy at all. It's just a question of telling the person, you're gone, you're out of the camp, and go and sit in mourning. Tear your clothes and let your hair be uncovered. What a strange remedy. It's not a medical remedy. So let's look at, for example, at something that is interesting, and that is that if it is only superficial, then the person is fine. But if it is deeper, more than skin deep, then it is a problem. And that we find in verse 3, the priest is to examine the sore on his skin, and if the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is leprosy. When the priest examines him, he shall pronounce him ceremonially unclean. And of course, this person who was pronounced unclean, who was pronounced to have this particular condition, tsa'arat, was banished from the camp, not only the camp, but from the tabernacle, from communion with God. Had to go outside the camp, sit in mourning, and cry out to God. So this idea of wearing torn clothes and uncovered hair, it signifies mourning, as we know, but also we find a lot of that to do with repentance. We think of the people in Nineveh. They tore their clothes and sat. And we also know the same about Job. So that's the important thing for us, is to realize that this condition, this leprosy, this tsa'arat, God gave it to the priests as an indication that a person has a problem, a hidden sin, and they had to go outside the camp, and the priest did not give any other remedy. And the priests only had one other function in the end, and that was when the person saw that the condition had gone. Obviously there was some transaction that happened between them and God. They could then send word to the priest, and the priest would come out of the camp and examine them. And this, of course, we see in Leviticus 14, but we'll go on with that next time. In Leviticus 14, the first few verses there, the priest is to go outside the camp and examine him. If the person has been healed of his leprosy, the priest shall order that 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood, cardamom, yarn, and hyssop be brought. Alright, so that's for next time, but I'm just referring to that so that we can see that the priest had 2 functions. The one was to examine and to send the person away, and the next involvement again was to examine the person again and declare them clean. They did not clean them, neither did the ritual that followed clean the person. It was God who had cleaned that person. The priest was simply the one who examined the person and declared them clean. And then there were certain rituals that they went through to reintegrate them into the camp and the tabernacle service. So it's interesting that in Numbers chapter 12, and maybe you want to just go there with me, Numbers chapter 12 and the first 10 verses. So maybe you want to take a bit of time, you want to pause what you're watching here and just read Numbers 12 verses 1 to 10. And there we have Miriam and Aaron actually speaking against Moses. And I'm going to read verse 10. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, there stood Miriam leprous. And so there's a very interesting example there, and what she had in her heart was some kind of jealousy or resentment towards Moses. You'll read it there in Numbers 12, verse 1 to 10. And I wonder about us. You know, we are poorer today for the fact that we don't have this kind of situation where God showed the priests, this one has a problem. Look, there's something coming out on their skin. I think of how many people sit in church with all sorts of hidden sin. No problem. It's all hidden. What if it was visible like this? And there was no place to hide. It's a better place for us. There's so much hidden in people's hearts. But they come to church, they sit there, and of course, there is no confrontation. of the heart in church anymore. That's all gone. It's also PC. Christianity has become so PC. And of course, hidden sin is able to thrive in secret because it's not exposed. But here in Leviticus 13, a person's hidden sin in their hearts was exposed by this condition that manifested itself on their skin. Would we stand up to this kind of scrutiny? So we need to understand that this condition was not what separated them from God. You see, God doesn't have something against boils or sores. We need to understand what is it that separates us from God. What separates us from God is sin. It was the same as Adam and Eve. They were banished from God's presence. Not because of this or that or the next thing, but because of sin. And in this person's life, they are separated from God. Just as it says in Isaiah 59 verse 2, our sin separates us from God. So these people were literally separated from the community, yes, but they were not allowed near the tabernacle. They had to first sort out what was going on in them. And of course we realize in the Jewish people, the reason why Jesus healed the lepers was because, look, everybody knew there was no cure for this condition. God alone could heal it, and so he was showing his divinity by healing the lepers, and the lepers followed him and cried out to him to be cleansed and to be healed. The point here really that I want to get to is the role of the priest. And if we take the role of the priest here in Leviticus 13 and we compare it to pastors and ministers and counselors today, let's look at some very interesting differences. Look at the priest's role here in Leviticus 13. What do you see? Basically, you see he examines the person, declares the person unclean, and sends the person away out of the camp. That's it. The next thing he does, the next time he's involved, is when he examines the person again, declares them clean, and then helps them go through the ritual to be reintegrated. That is it. Now, what about a remedy? What about some counseling? What about... No, none of that. The person is told, you go outside the camp, you sit in mourning and cry out to the living God. That is it. Now let's compare that to what we have today. My word, it's just this massive industry that has grown up around Christian counseling. Now 15 years already I've been involved in counseling people and pastoring. It's just what happens when you're in the ministry. But I must admit that most of the time people just want to talk about their problem, blame somebody else for it, and especially in marriage counseling, the one always wants you to say they are right and the other one is wrong. It wastes such a huge amount of time. And it never really leads to any change either. I must admit, I'm seeing more and more that what we call Christian counseling, a lot of it is a waste of time. Because people are unwilling to face the sin in their own heart, the jealousies, the hatreds, the bitternesses, the resentments, the anger. And then they want you, as the counselor, to sort it out somehow, but they still want to hold on to those things. It's just a waste of time. In marriage counseling, for example, they say, Werner, you must sort this marriage out. And I go, what? It's ridiculous. It's the people in the marriage that need to be sorted out, and then the marriage will work. You can't sort the marriage out as if that's something outside of yourself that can be sorted out. And it struck me here in Leviticus 13 how the priest, there's no no counseling, there's no self-help book, there's no watch this video, there's nothing. There's just the instruction, go and seek God. There's something in your heart. Off you go. And that's it. I thought it was amazing. Especially when we compare it with what goes on today and how much time is really wasted with counseling, but there's never any change because the person is not willing to face the sin in their own hearts. And perhaps this is what needs to happen. Perhaps we need to take more of this kind of approach. I remember in my own life, and God reminded me of this situation in my own life when I studied this passage. I had a very specific problem which manifests itself in a certain behavior, and for decades I walked around with this, and I went to counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists and even went on medication and all sorts of rubbish, and nothing helped, nothing changed. And then one day I came to this church, this little church in a little town, and this minister there knew me, and he knew my history, and he just looked at me and told me plainly, he said, go into the church there and don't come out until God has spoken to you. Cry out to him. Ask him to show you what your problem is. What is causing this behavior? And I don't want to see you until he has spoken to you. Off you go. And he walked away. And I was left there and I was thinking, oh, okay. So I went into the church and I sat there. And I just, sat there for the first hour, twiddling my thumbs, praying, sort of. In the second hour, still the same. The third hour, I really started crying out to the living God. And the fourth hour, he actually answered me, which was just phenomenal. God was actually very merciful to me. If I think about these people with this condition, I mean, some of them, I don't know how long they suffered with the condition until God actually healed them. But I was reminded of that, and that day marked an absolute watershed in my life regarding that particular behavior. God had shown me the root cause of it in my heart. And it lines up very beautifully with what these priests did. They just said to the person, listen, you go and talk to God, sort it out with him. You've got a problem, ask him to show you. It's marvelous, but we as counselors these days, oh no, that's the last thing we do, and yet that is the exact thing that needs to happen. So perhaps as we consider this passage and this message, and of course next week I will take it a step further with Leviticus 14, and we're going to look at the actual ritual which they had to go through to get reintegrated back into the community and the tabernacle. We need to give this a bit of thought. If you are a counselee, there's lots of food for thought here, and if you are a counselor, also a lot of food for thought. And I pray that the Lord will speak to our hearts, all of us, about simply seeking him and not trusting in this counselor, that book, that program, this 7-step plan, but to go to him and say, Lord, what rubbish is in my heart? Please show me that it can be dealt with. Amen.